Funding for this program has been provided by this station and other public television stations, and by grants from Exxon Corporation, Allied Chemical Corporation, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
In essence, I would have told the trial court and jury that I did not shoot Martin Luther King Jr., just as I'm not telling this committee. And if I would have had a lawyer to represent me, I could have offered conclusive proof in support of this denial.
Surrounded by the full panoply of a congressional hearing, James Earl Ray comes from prison to deny being the killer of Martin Luther King. Good evening. James Earl Ray, sentenced nearly a decade ago for the murder of Martin Luther King, appeared before the House Assassination Committee today and said firmly he was not the killer. It was a story Ray has told often in recent years in his effort to recant his original confession and win a new trial. But the drama of today's setting gave new emphasis to his plea: live television, a heavy guard of federal marshals, and a committee eager to restore its own prestige. After testifying for over 2 hours this morning, Ray pleaded exhaustion and was excused until tomorrow morning. Civil rights leaders claiming there was a conspiracy to murder King have urged the Justice Department to support a new trial. They were told the department would look at any new evidence the committee turned up. Tonight, the credibility of James Earl Ray. Jim Lehrer is off. Charlene Hunter-Galtz in Washington. Charlene?
Robin, James Earl Ray, 50 years old, has spent most of his adult life as a criminal. He's been variously portrayed as inept, bumbling, aimless, and a loner. And because of his frequent escape attempts, he earned the cell block nickname The Mole. A native of Alton, Illinois, Ray was the eldest of 9 children, the son of an alcoholic father. He dropped out of school in the 10th grade, drifted a while, and then joined the Army. Later, he was sentenced to hard labor for drunkenness and eventually discharged for ineptness. Beginning with a typewriter theft in Los Angeles, he engaged in petty burglary and other crimes over the next 10 years. An account of one getaway from a holdup said he forgot to close the car door and fell out as the vehicle swerved around a corner. After serving about 8 years of a 20-year sentence, he escaped from the Missouri State Prison on his 3rd attempt in 1967. He then traveled to numerous cities in the United States, Canada, and Mexico, using a variety of aliases. Martin Luther King was killed in Memphis on April 4th, 1968. On April 17th, 1968, a federal warrant was issued in Birmingham for Eric Starvo Galt, one of those aliases. On May 7th, 1968, Ray was indicted for the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. On June 8, 1968, he was arrested in London. On March 10, 1969, he pleaded guilty to that murder. And on August 16, 1978, this morning, he said he didn't do it. He pointed the finger at others instead, including the FBI.
I know several large publishing houses working with the FBI have offered up varied motivational allegations which are referred to below. In support of the government case against me, but it was not I who posted Martin Luther King's note suggesting he kill himself, rather it was the FBI. Nor was it the witness who celebrated upon hearing of his death. That too was the FBI. And it was also not I who in the 1930s infected blacks with syphilis germs for experimental purposes and declined to treat them. That was the actions of a governmental body with the acquiescence of the dominant press. The FBI was also harassing various members of my family in order to maneuver them into a position whereby they would have to perjure themselves against me in some matter related to the King case in order to escape imprisonment themselves. For instance, the FBI evidently burglarized my sister Carol Pepper's home in 1968 looking for incriminating evidence. See Jack Anderson column, November 8, 1977. Number 2, the FBI had my brother John L. Ray prosecuted and convicted for aiding and abetting a bank robbery, and the trial judge, now FBI Director William H. Webster, sentenced him to 18 years. Well, the actual robber later had his charge transferred to the Eastern District of California, where federal judge M.D. Croker sentenced the robber to 18 months. And the Wire Service reported on August the 8th, 1978, that the FBI had paid an informer, Oliver Patterson, to steal letters, wiretap conversations, etc., from another brother, Jerry W. Ray.
Following his escape from prison, Ray fled to Canada. He wanted to travel elsewhere but lacked documents and money. Hanging out at a Seaman's bar later, he said he met a man named Raoul, the mysterious gun-running figure Ray claims later set him up and framed him for Dr. King's murder. They met each other's needs for gun running and money. So far, no one has been able to prove Raoul's existence, but Ray clings firmly to his story about him.
Although I did contact an individual who introduced himself as Raoul. I first met him in the Neptune Tavern, 121 West Commissioner Street. He was approximately 35 to 40 years old, 5 feet 9 inches tall, with dark hair and a red tint in it, and he spoke with a slight Spanish accent. I assumed from his demeanor and conversation that our interests could be compatible, and after a couple meetings it was established that I was interested in some type of travel documents, while his interest was in locating someone who would, for a price, help him move some type contraband through United States Customs at the Canadian border. His proposals and my acceptance were, in essence, that I would meet him in Windsor, Canada at approximately 3:30 p.m. August 21st, 1967, near the railroad station in my automobile. That he would then provide me with certain packages to transport across the border into the United States. 4, that I would, for transporting the packages into the United States, be provided with travel documents and an unspecified amount of money. That thereafter I would sell the Plymouth automobile and travel to Birmingham, Alabama, wherein I would again meet Raoul for some similar type of smuggling operations, apparently in Mexico. Raoul had initially suggested I go to Mobile, Alabama.
Ray said he and Raoul smuggled guns from the United States to Mexico, and in April their smuggling activities brought them to Memphis. We pick up his testimony relating to the day of the murder. Raoul, he said, had sent him to purchase infrared binoculars for nighttime viewing.
After returning to the Main Street rooming house, I told Raoul we would have to purchase the infrared attachments at an Army surplus store. I also informed him that I had not eaten since breakfast. He said go out and have a meal and take in a movie since he wanted to see some people in private that evening. But to leave the Mustang out in front, as he would most likely need it that evening or night. I then went downstairs into Jim's Grill and ordered a beer, although I did not drink it. I say this because I recall seeing a white waitress on one occasion while I was in the establishment, and on the next occasion there was a black waitress on duty. The point if I can digress here, the point I'm trying to make here is I was in the grill on 2 different occasions, at least. Leaving the grill, I sat in the Mustang 10 or 15 minutes before traveling north on Main Street and entering a bar and restaurant located on the left-hand side of the street and fairly near a movie house across the street. I ordered a sandwich, and while sitting there, recalled that I had changed the back rear tire on the right side when facing the front of the Mustang the day before, after the tire had developed a slow leak. Thinking the damaged tire could be fixed, especially if the Mustang should be used that night, I returned to the Mustang and drove it north on Main Street for maybe 3 or 4 blocks before turning right and traveling 4 or 5 more blocks to a service station. There were 2 or 3 service stations at the intersection. I inquired of one if they could fix its spare tire while I waited, and I was informed that I would have to wait a while because of the business volume. Moving to the other station, I do not recall asking for the tire to be repaired, although I did have the Mustang serviced. Upon leaving the station, I circled around in the manner that would return me to the original parking space in front of Jim's Grill. However, when driving onto Main Street, I saw a police car parked blocking off the street that I would have to drive through in order to return to my original parking space. In addition, I saw what appeared to be 2 or 3 people running or walking rather fast up opposite the police car. I then veered off to the left towards South Memphis, traveling to what appeared to be a predominantly black community. I eventually ended up in Mississippi, traveling toward New Orleans, Louisiana. It was my intention to phone New Orleans, where a New Orleans number in my possession, and have the party on the other end attempt to find out what, if anything, had happened in the area of the aforementioned Main Street rooming house. However, shortly after entering the state of Mississippi, I heard over the car radio that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had been shot in Memphis. A short while later, approximately 15 minutes, another news bulletin on the radio stated police authorities were looking for a white Mustang and a white male subject as suspect in the shooting of Dr. King. Consequently, the first intersection I came to, I turned east, traveling toward Atlanta, Georgia. If I may digress here just a second. In respect to this tire I mentioned, 3 or 4 years ago, my brother we was talking about my private property in Memphis, and he said as soon as I pled guilty, the Attorney General's office called him to the office and gave him this tire plus the floorboards out of the Mustang. So, the floor mats out of the Mustang. Yes. But I imagine the Memphis prosecutor's office will substantiate that or disprove it. Continuing with the statement, by way of Birmingham, Alabama. Shortly after turning east, I stopped the Mustang and threw various items out of the trunk, including all of the camera equipment that Raoul had me purchased for him. The equipment was still in the original wrapping cases when I discarded it. It was raining slightly at the time, and I took a cloth and attempted to wipe off any fingerprints I may have left on the outside of the Mustang.
Ray closed his statement with a scathing attack on one of his lawyers, Percy Foreman. He hired Foreman shortly after his arrest for the King murder, but soon thereafter, Ray fired him. Ray claims that Foreman talked him into a false plea of guilty.
The Attorney Foreman then commenced on February 13, 1969, maneuvering me into a guilty plea. Foreman's argument for the plea were, in essence, one, that the press had already convicted me by inflaming the minds of potential jurors, that the government had bribed an alleged witness, Charles Stevens, into purging himself against me by offering Stevenson $100,000 reward to say he had saw someone favoring me leaving the rooming house where Dr. King was allegedly shot from, immediately after the shot was fired. 3, that it would in some manner be in my financial interest to plead guilty as charged. 4, that the trial judge wanted a guilty plea because he was concerned the blacks might burn down the town. In respect to Percy Foreman and the judge's ex parte meetings arranged the plea. Apparently, the two had eight meetings. Then later in March of 1969, Foreman said that if the case was not settled through a guilty plea, the government would most likely arrest my brother, Jerry W. Ray, under some type of conspiracy charge in the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. homicide. He also said that the FBI would most likely arrest my father, George Ray, who was near 7 years old, and have him returned to the Iowa State Prison, wherein he had escaped in the 1930s. If I may digress here just a second, Mr. Chairman, my brother John Ray also mentioned this fact to me around March 7th or 8th of 1969. Now, I think Mr. Foreman, he made an oblique reference to this thing. He said something, he didn't come right out and say it directly, but he made a kind of a slanting reference to it. Returning to the statement, in conjunction with the aforementioned threats and promises, Percy Foreman convinced me he would throw the case if I managed to force him to trial. In fact, in an article published in Look magazine in May of 1961, sold to the publication by Percy Foreman for $1,000, he in effect admitted he would have thrown the case if I would have forced him to trial. Consequently, through written contracts, I agreed on March 9th, 1969, to enter the guilty plea.
Ray will continue his testimony tomorrow morning. Robin?
Now a little perspective on today's testimony for the benefit of those of us who have not followed in intimate detail the often confusing allegations and counter-allegations in the Ray saga. The Reverend Jesse Jackson was a staff member of Martin Luther King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Yesterday, he asked the Justice Department to support a new trial for Ray. Reverend Jackson, do you believe Ray's statement today that he did not kill Martin Luther King?
I am convinced that James Earl Ray did not act alone. It has not yet been established that he killed Dr. King conclusively, and yet it has not been established that he did not, because he certainly was an accomplice to that murder. We do know that he bought that rifle. We do know that he had fingerprints on that rifle. And so unless he is willing to give more information about the existence of Raoul than he has presently, then he is going to have to suffer that burden alone.
You've talked to him personally, I believe. How do you evaluate Ray's credibility now?
Well, I believe Ray really is a pathological liar. I mean, he is a subculture criminal. Ray's object for wanting to talk with us was to get out of jail. And our object for talking with Ray was to try to find out the truth, to find out not only Ray, but who all was involved in the assassination of Dr. King. I think we need to establish that Ray is not this stumbling, bumbling, inept guy. If you will listen to him reading his testimony, you'll find a guy that's fairly coherent and literate, who reads well and has a command of the language that's very different from the images we've gotten of Ray historically.
I was going to say that listening to him just now, I felt it hard to believe that that was his own language that he was reading.
Well, the fact is that he was reading it so well and so rapidly, and using words as he digressed, words like oblique, which are not words that are very common use. My only point is that Ray is not someone that's kind of stupid and kind of out of it with a faraway look in his eye. As a matter of fact, we took Dr. Alvin Poussaint with us, a Harvard psychiatrist, just to kind of clinically observe some of Ray's demeanor. And among other things, Ray never had a psychiatrist to view him during this 10-year period. And usually lawyers, I mean, as a very elementary step, are trying to have a psychiatrist to view their client so as to determine their fitness, trying to appeal to a judge for some mercy. My real conclusion was that Ray was involved, even more involved than he has told us so far. I think Ray knows much more about Raoul than he has told us, but what I'm really concerned about is the involvement of the FBI. From the time Dr. King received the Nobel Peace Prize until 1 hour before the assassination, the FBI was on him 24 hours a day, with up to 25 men, never less than 7, thousands of man-hours, millions of dollars, and it is said in some of the documents here in Washington that the same kind of vigorous search with which they go after a Russian or a foreign espionage agent or spy, all of those techniques and more were used on Dr. King. So we do know that the FBI did in fact engage in character assassination. Whether or not they went as far as physical assassination, that ultimately must come out as well in these hearings.
Can I ask you this, Reverend Jackson? I'm wondering why you and Ralph Abernathy and others are not willing to wait until this committee has come up after its exhaustive investigation with its conclusions. Do you believe the committee has more evidence that would support Ray's plea for a new trial?
Well, really, we do support the committee. I think that inasmuch as there has been some attempts in the last few days to not refund the committee or to extend its funding, we've simply tried to be as visible as possible, letting the Congress and the nation know that it is not right to cut off their money. We think that during this week, Ray has a chance to substantiate whether or not he deserves a trial. If indeed, in my judgment, Ray does not come with much more clarity than he has come on Raoul, and Jerry Ray and Jerry Ray's relationship to Percy Foreman and Percy Foreman's relationship to whoever hired him, then he does not deserve a trial. He has a splendid opportunity to come clean before the nation.
But he has not yet, in your view, so far as today's testimony is concerned, substantiated his claim to a new trial.
My impression is that Ray is holding back, either because he's still trying to protect his family or because he's intimidated and his life is threatened. But I get the impression that when hit with the critical questions by Congressman Louis Stokes, there was a kind of hedging on some of the areas where he must come much clearer in.
Well, thank you. Charlene?
A New York Times investigative unit has been following the work of the assassination committee and doing its own investigations into Dr. King's murder. The chief of that unit is veteran reporter Nicholas Horrock. Nick, in your view, did anything new come out today?
There were giblets. He told us today, for the first time in his own words, how he really gets out of the Missouri State Penitentiary, which he lied about the first time, allegedly to protect a fellow prisoner. He tells us a little bit more about his money and his movements around the country. But in fact, with the exception of his mention of some material developed by Mark Lane, his lawyer, through Freedom of Information, that is the report that a man who bent over Dr. King at his death may have been an undercover policeman from Memphis Police Department, there was very little new. And even that report had some currency prior to that, but it has never been investigated properly.
You brought that up about the appearance of this person. Does that change anything, the appearance of this undercover agent, the document?
I think it points up that the ground investigation from the beginning was inadequately carried out. Reverend Jackson, for example, was at the scene and was not interviewed by the FBI. Reverend Abernathy testified yesterday. He wasn't interviewed. So some very basic groundwork was not done either by police or the Bureau, and this new report would show that that might be very important, who he was, why he was there, and so forth.
And that might be the basis for some of the claims
conspiracy questions, yeah.
You know, I think
excuse me just a minute, Jesse. Let me just pursue this question. Did you find Ray a credible witness today? There were many commentators who said he appeared nervous and rambling and incoherent at times.
Been in the jail for 10 years, and a lot of it alone, and I think that accounts for all of that kind of emotional thing. It's a poor day to judge him. He really hasn't been on this kind of a scene before. But on the other hand, as far as credibility, I think the question of why Raul remains such a flat character, we never know much about Raul. Now, he spends time, 6 or 7 hours of conversation. He has not one anecdote, not one interesting little thing. Raul is flat, and he's always been flat in anything Ray has said or written.
So in your view...
And so that question, that raises a serious question in my mind of credibility.
In terms of your investigations, have you been able to come up with anything more substantial about this shadowy figure?
Not anything about Ray, but I think it is very important to notice the one thing the Justice Department criticizes its own FBI for, not examining Ray's relationship with his family. And I know that many of the House investigators speculate that the one person or two people that he might not want to tell more about, who might be somehow connected with this, would be members of his own family, his loved ones. So there is a question whether Raul exists, and if he doesn't exist, is he someone Ray cannot talk about?
Right. One final question, and quickly. Some people have characterized this hearing as a catharsis, others as a circus. How do you view it?
I hope it's not a circus. I have a personal feeling about that. I hope it is not a circus, but I think that this committee has squandered an awful lot of money over the thing and an awful lot of time and left the American people at this juncture with very little more information.
And none of the evidence that has come up today, even the small bits and pieces, in your mind, justify it?
Not yet.
Thank you. Robin?
Mr. Jackson, Reverend Jackson, do you believe that even if James Earl Ray doesn't come clean on the mysterious character of Raul, and even if his own personal credibility is not established, that there is enough doubt to justify the new trial that you went to see Assistant Attorney General Civiletti about yesterday?
Well, you know, whether we go the route of trial or hearing becomes kind of technical and legal language. I think that even though that Raul is a flat character and Ray is perhaps a liar, subculture criminal, the fact that the FBI had such a tremendous commitment to destroying this man's character and ultimately his life suggests that Ray is operating within a context of some conspiracy. He may have been a cog in the wheel so small that he can't get beyond the flat character. But we are fairly convinced that circumstantial evidence suggests that there was other involvement, perhaps the government.
I see. What's your view on that, Mr. Horrock? Do you think that, apart from Ray's credibility, are there enough doubts from your investigation to justify a new examination of this in a courtroom?
I think that the greatest loss of the country was there wasn't originally a trial. I think there should be a new examination. On the other hand, as an investigator, The trail is very cold now. There are people dead. The Times developed information about 2 men who allegedly offered money to kill Dr. King. Both of them are dead. Had the FBI followed up on that report when they first learned of it, at least one of those men probably would have been alive, and at least they could have interviewed him. So I'm not sure that it can be repaired now, but I do think it's worth trying.
Despite your doubts about the work of this committee, does its labor so far constitute a sufficient forum of investigation, or would only a trial, the formal proceedings in a trial, answer the demand?
I think a trial would be preferable, because throughout Watergate and our other jail for perjury, the committee does have indirectly that kind of power, contempt power, but it is not as lethal as a grand jury and an immediate indictment.
Reverend Jackson, do you and Reverend Ralph Abernathy have any fear that because you, as former colleagues and close friends of Dr. King, believe there are doubts about the case, that you may be being used by James Earl Ray as part of his, as you said earlier, attempt to get out of jail?
Well, I think it's very clear that James Earl Ray wants to use us to get back to court. And we want to use the presence and the existence of James Earl Ray to find out who all was involved in this assassination. We're not deceived for one moment as to what Ray's motives are. I think the real issue here is that there has never been a trial, and there was a tremendous amount of information squashed, and perhaps a tremendous number of people killed. Let us not forget that one man in the FBI who had a tremendous body of data, a Mr. Sullivan, the number 3 man in the FBI, who had somewhat broken with the Hoover line, this line that Dr. King was a communist threat to the country and therefore had to be destroyed. Mysteriously, this man was mistaken to be a deer in Vermont and killed. He would represent a real connection with the whole FBI theory.
We have to leave it there, Reverend Jackson. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Hart. Good night, Charlene.
Good night, Robin.
That's all for tonight. We'll be back tomorrow night. I'm Robert McNeil. Good night.
For a transcript, send $1 to the McNeil-Lehrer Report, Box 345, New York, New York, 10019. The McNeil-Lehrer Report was produced by WNET and WETA. They are solely responsible for its content. Funding for this program has been provided by this station and other public television stations, and by grants from Exxon Corporation, Allied Chemical Corporation, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.